Geeks love nothing more than speculating about what scarce information we have and what it could possibly mean. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. And thank you for joining us today. Today, we are going to be talking about the leader of the party. We've had some experience, particularly of late in our first edition Monday game, and a lot of we've had some, some very interesting things develop as far as like leadership in the party. Not infighting, but more just, well, it seems like nobody wants to be the fucking leader.
So we're doing the old school first edition D&D method where you have player roles as well as character roles, the first of which is the caller. And the purpose of the caller is to be kind of the final say, the liaison between the group and the dungeon master, who says, okay, we've discussed our thoughts together as a party, and here, Dungeon Master, is what we have decided to do. And that's an important role because it's essentially declaring as canonical whatever the action is that the group is going to be doing next, and then that gives the DM something to play off of for consequences and effects and so on. Without that, you get a lot of people kind of mealy mouth, just speculating on what could be, and it sometimes gets really tricky the way that people talk, because we've all been kind of conditioned to stay away from assertive language and instead just kind of like, oh well, this or that or whatever, and so it's like, okay, did you walk down the fucking hallway or not?
Yeah, and I admit I do this. I am so bad about being the person who always provides just one more alternative, just one more thought I had, something to consider. I've been trying to fix myself of it since I realized just how much I do it, but man, it is a difficult thing to break. And like you said, you need someone to cut through the bullshit and say, okay, this is what we are doing. Because I know I've been a DM in a lot of games where if I were to let the players figure out what they're going to be doing as a group, we would be there for hours. I remember literally the very first game of D&D that I ever played. Me and the 4 other players, we debated for 9 hours on how we were going to attack a guard on patrol at a fort we needed to infiltrate. We debated for 9 hours on attacking one guard.
Jesus fucking Christ. I would have been done after 30 minutes. What kept you there?
Well, we were all it was literally the first game we ever played, the first session we ever played. And we were still coming to terms with what the game was. And not all of us were friends. We all had connections between each other, but we weren't all friends. And so there was a level of both not understanding the game, that this is a group game, and that while we were young and like I made this character, I want my character to be played exactly how I have the character envisioned. And if something went against the way the character was in our minds, then there were a couple of us who were just very bullheaded and not wanting to give an inch for anything because it's, quote, not what my character would do.
Okay, one of those kind of situations.
Yeah.
So in preparation for this, I was thinking about some of the fictional portrayals of teams that we all have as touchstones, and what those team dynamics and leadership within them look like. And some of them are obvious. The Avengers and Captain America, for instance. Um, Star Trek: The Next Generation and Captain Picard, probably the greatest leader I've ever witnessed in any media. Um,
Here, here.
then you get ones that are a little weirder, like Lord of the Rings, for instance. You got Aragorn as kind of the inherited, like would-be king. Like his authority comes from some bloodline. You got Gandalf, who's an authority because of some wisdom and insight about what's going on or whatever. Um, but the Fellowship doesn't stay together for that long, and uh, Aragorn isn't really calling the shots that much, and he's one of those. He's Strider. He's the weird guy in the corner. He's that trope from the beginning, and it's not until suddenly in Return of the King where he's like suddenly in a crown and all this. That's part of his arc. And then you've got Star Wars, where I'll be goddamned. Can you tell me who the fucking leader character is in the Star Wars crew?
I can't.
Yeah, it just kind of works out. I was thinking about like X Men's a similar thing as Avengers, where you've got like Cyclops or Professor X, depending on which scale you're talking about. But with Star Wars, I was like, okay, why is this different? Why is there no leader character? It's not Leia, and it's not Luke, it's not Han. Um, and I think it's because in that story, the story is all about Luke Skywalker. The story is not about the group. So we've got to look for examples from media that is telling the stories of each of the different characters. And so I kept going back to Marvel and to Star Trek. I think those are the two that D&D can learn the most from, way more than Lord of the Rings. I don't know. What do you think?
100% agree. I would also add like Firefly in as a very good way of specifically dealing with, well, both Avengers and X-Men do this too, but just dealing with very disparate personalities who could be at each other's throats. I feel like in Firefly, the group is together purely for profit motive, and I think that scales better to what a typical D&D party is more than X-Men and Avengers and all of the like superhero teams and things like that. I also think that maybe like some of the more early Mission Impossible movies back before they really were just about Ethan Hunt, although all along they have been about just about Ethan Hunt. It seems like in the earlier movies the team had more of like the other members of the team had more spotlight than in the most recent movies.
Yeah. Um, so all of these examples that we're coming up with, there's important narrative reasons why this group of characters are together. And, in a natural state, uh, all characters are individuals and they're just going to bounce around doing whatever, their self-interest and their whim takes them towards. Um, and I have a note here. I wanted to throw out this idea that I have that like characters, especially in a role playing context, without any kind of narrative cohesion to bind them together as a group, and without a leader to send them with some kind of velocity in some kind of direction, they're going to behave very much like particles in sort of a fluid dynamic situation. So, if you've got a gas in a container or some kind of particulate inside a liquid medium, over time it's going to just randomly move around until it's evenly distributed throughout whatever the container is. And in the context of a role playing game, that container is the entire fucking planet or the entire fucking multiverse. So there's no way that you can have any kind of meaningful story that relates people together without them having something that binds them towards a common purpose, and then some individual that makes sure that they're moving towards that purpose. And I think that that idea makes people pretty uncomfortable these days. I've got some thoughts as to why. What do you think about all this?
Yeah, your analogy definitely works a lot better than mine. My analogy was like herding cats, where if you've ever been in a house with multiple cats, and I'm not talking like one or two, I mean like I've been in some houses with like five or six or more cats. There are the cats who are at any particular time, at any given moment, there are cats who are active doing something in far flung parts of the house. Some of the cats are interacting, some of them are doing their own thing, like playing with their own toys. Some of them are just watching the other cats, and some of them are asleep, and some of them are just grooming themselves. And I feel like that's an analogy of like what it is to look at a party of player characters. Whenever I look around, I can point out who's being the cat who's active, who's the one who's just there watching, and etc.
I've definitely played that session many, many times.
And the reason why I had the analogy of the cat is because it is possible to get everybody's attention at once, but damn, it's hard. And to get them all to do a particular thing is nigh impossible. And I feel like there's this fear from every single player sitting around the table that no player wants to be the one to impose themselves on the other players at the table. And I feel like that's a big reason as to why like there is a block that most people don't want to step into that leadership role, because there is some responsibility to that. And you're not only responsible for your character, you're also kind of responsible for the outcome of what happens to all of the player characters. And in this game where each one of us is our own unique special snowflake, and each one of us has a very wildly different personality and play style and all of that, any sort of constraint feels like oppression. And at least that's how I see a lot of players seem to take it. Even if you ask them, they may deny it, but it's an observation that I've had.
I think this is a generational thing. So I've been digging into a lot of what the play style was like in first edition D&D, white box D&D, BX, while I've been preparing for this old school campaign that I'm running. And these rules were there, and I don't see much evidence of people being so skittish about it. I have read some stuff about people struggling for power and people saying fuck you and going their own way and whatever, for sure. That's going to happen, but what I don't see is this like timidity that I've seen at every table that I've sat at with people under the age of, let's say, 40 maybe. And I know that you don't like to get into politics in this podcast, and I mostly agree this is not the place for it. But with this sort of thing, since we're talking about leadership, our shared cultural perceptions of leadership are exactly what's at play here. And I think that this is generational because it pairs with a noticeable decline in the esteem that we have for our leaders, and deservedly so. You know, like when I was a very young kid, people thought the president of the United States was like the smartest guy, and he's got to be, this great, like, pillar of moral superiority and yada yada. I mean, this is me from a kid's perspective. And yeah, we had shitbag presidents or whatever. But then, like, right as I got into my teenage years, like, wait a minute, the president got caught getting a blowjob. And then it's been like downhill from there. Leader after leader, party after party. What the fuck is going on? At this point, uh, I'm struggling to come up with an example of of real effective and moral leadership from a real person in our lives. You know, it's no shock that it immediately feels like oppression.
Yeah, I'm trying to decide whether I want to keep going down this rabbit hole of making comparisons to the modern day. I will just say that I think that the biggest part of that disconnect from what of not being able to have that idea of a leader now, a lot of it just pertains to, I think a lot of it can be traced back to the fact that people who are famous and who are leaders no longer have private lives. So we get to see everything. We get to hear everything. And that keeps that mystique of the leader who, like, you use Star Trek as an example or of a great leader. Like, there's an episode of Star Trek where Captain Picard and Dr. Crusher are on a planet, and they are basically trapped there. They're being held prisoner. They are telepathically linked in order to keep them both in the same place at the same time. And so they discover, like, Dr. Crusher at one point realizes how much of Picard's assuredness is just a show. Like, he has doubts, but he cannot ever really show that doubt, that uncertainty. And I feel like in our modern age, we are a lot closer to having that telepathic bond to all of the people who could potentially be our leader. And now we see every single time they fuck up, and it's a lot harder to hide when they fuck up because all of our leaders in the past have fucked up.
Yeah, I think you're right to a large extent there. Yeah, I also think that the world generally is just becoming a much more cynical kind of place, and from the leadership on down. And there's been lots of political analysis about uh, how far apart the country is politically compared to where it used to be on certain sets of issues. Like there's major divides happening, and the amount of cutthroat politics that's going on with that sort of thing is it's turned things much more into like a Game of Thrones kind of scenario where even if fairly forthright leaders with some amount of integrity step up to the plate, they're going to get crushed just under the sheer corruption of the system, one way or the other. So we're we're desperate for some kind of uh, you know examples of leadership, I think, and I think that's a lot of what's going on with things like Twitter outrage and things like that. A lot of that is performative wokeness and narcissism and that kind of thing. But I think also a lot of it is this feeling of a void of any leadership, because that's anxiety inducing for a society. If you don't have, it's anxieties like that that demagogues play on, and they show up and say, "Here's the answers. You can relax now. I've got the wheel," and that's what you don't want. So it's tough in a world like today where we don't want to say this person's right, this person's wrong. We want to say everybody's got their story and they're living their truth, and don't step on anyone's toes, don't use aggressive language or any of that kind of thing. And so that filters into our game experience because we're having a social experiment at the game table in this modern context with all this shit playing in the back of our psyche. And it's funny how that ethos crashes headlong into the hard math of like an ogre punch.
Yeah, I see a lot of what I agree with a lot of what you said. And I personally, I know from my job, like if I am in if I'm in a position of leadership at work, I really don't want that whenever I am also at play. And I think that can be a big part of it too, is part of why I'm playing this game is to get away from real life responsibilities. And if at work I have to do a leadership role, then I'm less likely to play the leader whenever I get into a role playing game. But then you come into the situation that somebody has to be there to make the decision of what we are going to do. Because like in my opening gamer story of first game I ever DM'd, like players will sit and they'll talk and they'll talk and they'll talk an idea to death for as long as they are allowed to. Jordan, in our Monday game, there have been times where you have said, okay, what are you guys doing? And that is definitely something that is needed. And there needs to be a particular voice for the players to say, okay, enough deliberating. We need to get something done tonight. This is what we are going to do. And one of the reasons why players don't want to step into that role is each player, when they feel that responsibility, they don't want to make the bad call. They don't want to be the one who is responsible for getting into a fight and then one of the players going down, because that's what it is to be a leader. If something goes wrong, it's them who gets blamed.
Yeah, the burden of leadership is definitely a real thing, and people have brought that up to me specifically as reasons why they don't want to play the caller role. But honestly, I feel like uh, if you don't have someone at the wheel, it's more of a dangerous situation for everyone involved than if you do have someone who will inevitably make a bad call now and then because they're humans. So, like we were saying before, you start out in a natural state where you've got a bunch of individuals. Let's assume that you've got some narrative reason, or the group has just decided to make the concession that this is a game and we all want to experience it together, so they're going to stick together regardless of what else goes on. All right, so then you've got a group. In my way of looking at it, you then have two choices. That group can either be a team, which takes work, or it will default to a herd. And what I mean by this is that a team is a group of individuals that are working together to complement each other and be more effective than they would be individually or even just as the sum of their parts, because of that complementary nature of their tactics. A herd wanders around in each other's vicinity and eventually just gets fed upon by predators. And that's what I see playing out in real time in D&D. When a bunch of characters go into a dungeon, nobody's directing anyone and people are just wandering off, and then, oh, what do you know, there's a fucking ambush predator there and somebody gets eaten, because that's what happens.
And it also happens when there is absolutely no pre-planning. I think that's one of the major things that a leader really brings to the game is it prevents bad shit like that from happening to the players. It prevents the one player from getting too far ahead, or if you're from one player somehow getting separated from the group, because players or characters are easily distracted. You give them a new piece of information and they immediately want to follow up on that new piece of information, and it really doesn't matter. Sometimes they're just not paying attention, and they hear something, it catches their attention, and they go off and investigate that, and there's no request for information from the other player sitting around the table as to whether or not that's a good idea. I feel like communication is a big part of what the leader needs to be there to facilitate, to make sure that everybody is on the same page about something, and to make sure that somebody didn't lapse in their attention and suddenly get snapped back into attention and find that their character is somewhere else.
Yeah, and that takes some meta conversation, because you have to have the group bought into this idea. You have to have authority placed in the hands of the leader for this to work, because the leader with that authority can then veto somebody else's action and effectively give an order and say, no, stay put, don't go down the hallway or whatever. And the group has to agree that, okay, that's this person's role, to look at things from a group level perspective and not as at an individual level perspective, and make decisions that are for the good of the whole, not just catering to whatever the desires of the individual happen to be in the moment. And it's a hard thing to do, and sure there's going to be butting heads over stuff, and that's the stuff of good drama. I wouldn't want to get rid of any of that. But when it comes to just the square by square procedure of getting in and out of a place alive, uh, this just kind of random wandering thing is not going to work.
I don't know if if you've noticed this, but in most of the games that I have been a part of, there is in some way a de facto leader. This is a person who is just more dominant at the table. Usually there's one, in my experience, but sometimes there's two. Um, and I've been in situations where that de facto leader, in some way or another, actually like kind of gets assigned to actually be an official leader. And the moment they're no longer the de facto leader, they're the actual leader, they lose pretty much all of the things that they were doing as the de facto leader. They're no longer giving suggestions to other players. They like you used the word timid earlier. Taking on that like an official responsibility somehow flicks a switch that makes all of the players that makes the player that is now the leader just so much more timid. I saw this in as we are recording this, our most recent game, where Elliot, as he was playing his character, or his characters have been kind of the one to basically interact with the environment and start shit. He's done that quite a few times. There have been a couple other players to do it as well, but with Elliot most recently taking on the role of caller, we ran from we ran from one, and then we tried to run from a second fight during the session that we probably wouldn't have. The first one we definitely probably should have gone ahead and set up for, because it sounded like it was a perfect ambush that we could have done. And I that it's just something that stood out in my mind, that he took on the role of caller, and suddenly we were running away from fights rather than preparing for fights.
Yeah. Um,
Although I will say that those noises you played over over Discord, of the sounds that were coming down the corridor, yeah, those were some pretty fucked up sounds, and I can understand characters getting frightened and like getting timid, but on the other hand, we're there to explore this dungeon. We're there to whatever it was that was coming, we had plenty of time to set up for.
well, I'm very glad to know that it was terrifying, because I firmly believe that Dungeons and Dragons at its best is a horror game, and so glad to know that you guys were peeing a little bit at the sound of those creatures. And I I thought that I had made it clear enough that at least the gnolls explicitly, I said, were restrained, that they were like uh, chained up in that room. So you heard them. They weren't coming after you. They were just aware of your presence and making a racket. So, and also, as your leader for that group, uh, you had what is effectively a 12-year-old girl in charge. Um, Now, this group started out as a group of soldiers who specialized in dungeoneering in a holy crusade, and they would go down into dungeons to kill monsters and get gold for the war effort, and rescue people and things like that. This is exactly what you all have been doing, supposedly, for years. So I've been hoping all along that some kind of procedure would emerge, that some kind of hierarchy would work itself out, so that people would understand, like, here's my specialty, here's the chain of command, here's how the whole machine kind of clicks together. Um, I I tried doing that at the beginning with the rank system. That seemed to have fallen apart completely, and no one seems interested at all in maintaining any of that kind of uh, structure to things. So you are going to need to figure something out as a group. Yeah, I don't know if it's, yeah, having elections or what it is, but I mean, you all are going to dance yourselves right into a TPK if you're not careful.
So I have a quick question about specifically the caller in our game. Is the caller a meta game position, or is it supposed to be something that is in character? The player's character is actually the one who is making the calls for the party, or is this a meta game position where we are all playing our characters, and then when it comes down to what's the actions that are happening, somebody steps out of character and relays the information to the DM? Because I kind of thought it was the second, but I'm not 100% certain.
So, like many things in early D&D, it can be taken a number of different ways and is described in a number of different ways. I'm not sure how much of a distinction was made early on between character and player roles. I think that that's much more a part of the modern play paradigm, but the way that I'm doing it is that I'm assigning it as a metagame role that a player takes to facilitate the play procedure of the game, just like the cartographer, just like anybody who is acting as a chronicler. No one is actually physically writing down all the stuff that's happening as you're walking through the corridors. However, that bit about the cartographer, though, there's a lot of descriptions in early D&D that sound very much like someone is in fact drawing these corridors on parchment as you're walking, 10 steps or whatever. And that's part of why your movement is so slow. Like someone's actually sketching this shit out as you go. So I don't know. It's what I'm trying to do is make all the inter-party politics a matter for you all to work out amongst yourselves. I I don't want to declare a leader, but you guys need a leader.
Yeah.
So one of the points I wanted to bring up about why leadership is hard is that it it's one of those things where the answer isn't on the sheet. That though some games try to have some kind of leadership mechanic, all I've ever seen it really work out to be is the ability to throw some dice buffs here and there, or some temporary hit points, or some kind of shit like that. Not much different than anything that a cleric or a bard or anything like that could do. And I don't think that charisma is a leadership stat at all. To me, if you're really going to try to nail down one of the six D&D attributes that is leadership, I'd have to say it's wisdom. What do you think?
Um, well, are you asking me what about the historical origin of charisma, or are you asking about the modern definition of charisma? Because those are two very different things. Originally, charisma was literally the divine ability to lead. It was the divine right of kings. That was charisma. But in modern parlance, charisma is just being able to talk with people.
Yeah, and as far as all of the mechanics that have grown out of the charisma ability that I've seen, um, I haven't seen much that makes me think that they were thinking about that classical definition of the term, which is interesting, uh, considering the game. But, charisma powers bluff, it powers, performance, it powers um, diplomacy and bargaining and things like that. It's much closer to manipulation than uh, being an effective leader. Like, yeah, maybe getting compliance from people is part of it, but if you're doing it in these sneaky kind of ways, I don't think that's any kind of durable framework for leadership. I have an assertion to make, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. Of the D&D classes, and I'll take the classes that are current in fifth edition. Of those classes, I think the very best class to be the leader, bar none, is the fighter. What do you think?
Paladin. But I'm partial to paladins.
You are partial to paladins, but I highly disagree about that.
All right. Why is that?
Well, because if you look at, I'll put the paladin in the same bucket with the cleric and the warlock and the druid. These are classes that have an allegiance to some kind of power, some kind of entity that is separate from the party. And so any call that they're going to make is ultimately going to be in the interest of whatever this power is that they serve. So that's why I think that they are not the best leaders for the party. For the same reason, I think but the locus uh, of devotion being selfish, I would disqualify the wizard, the sorcerer, the bard, the rogue, those classes. I would put the monk in the same bucket as the paladin too, by the way. Um, and I think the barbarian probably falls into more of that selfish category, because they're just going to flip out, and they're worried about their own reactions and their own uh, you know battle prowess or whatever. But the fighter is interesting. A fighter gets dropped into this situation, and he's on the front line. He's not leading from the back. He's not asking anybody to do anything he wouldn't do. Uh, he has a view of the situation. He's tough enough to stay up there at the front and square up against whatever big bad leader guy comes up and wants to talk shit. But he doesn't have any built-in class-based uh, devotion to anything but his comrades. So I think the fighter is the best leader.
I definitely see your point. And definitely the fighter doesn't the fighter is able to think outside of the box more than the stereotypical paladin is able to, because the paladin has their paladin's code. I say paladin because of the origin of charisma, and of the term charisma. And when I think of a paladin, I think of the 12 Peers of Charlemagne. I think of the Knights of the Round Table. Those types of paragon leaders. That's what I want out of a paladin. But yeah, I definitely see what you're saying as far as like if like a paladin make in my if I may put an analogy here, in our descriptions here, the paladin is better as the lieutenant, whereas the fighter is better as the sergeant, where the sergeant is the one who figures out the nuts and bolts of how shit's going to get done.
Yeah, and it's easy to fuck over a paladin from a paladin-led party from a DM's perspective, because all you got to do is throw an enemy that understands the self-imposed moral restrictions on that character's decision scope of decision making, and then just put them in situations where they're basically their own enemy because of these things that they refuse to do. And it's very much like the Joker, Heath Ledger's Joker. Uh, you can just fuck people up if you can make them war against their own convictions.
Definitely.
So, all right, where do we go from here? We've discussed uh, why people are afraid of being the leader, why they don't want to be the leader, why you need a leader, what's going to happen if you don't have a leader. Um, what else do you want to talk about? I've got a list of ways that I think you should try to lead well, like things that I think are qualities of good leadership. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, let's talk about that but before that, let's talk a little bit about just how in a role-playing game we have dealt with the leadership problem of no one wanting to be the leader. Because in our Bena game, during session 0, before we created characters, the group voted on whose character was going to be the leader, and you were voted to be the leader of the party. I felt like that for the most part that went very well. And not only did we get a person, like everybody was on board with you making a character who everybody else was agreeing was going to be the leader. We were in this was a military mercenary campaign from the onset, so everybody went in with the expectation that we're going to be in a hierarchy. We're going to have somebody who has to be at the top, and I, as the GM, mandated that there wasn't going to be an NPC who was going to be leading you guys. One of the players had to be the leader, and it worked out very well. Partially because when you got elected to be leader, then another player decided, you know what, I'm going to be second in command. And during the course of the game, the second in command pretty much became leader. At first, he was de facto leader, and then he became actual leader. And I feel like as long as you let the players know ahead of time that this is a thing, we didn't have any problems with it. I'm at least from my perspective, we didn't have any problems with it. What was your perspective of that?
Um, well, at the beginning of the game, you allowed people to nominate themselves to be voted on to be a leader. And I was one. I think was there only one other person, or were there two other people? It's been too long now.
I know KP nominated himself, but I don't remember if there was a third.
Corey did. Yeah. So I initially wanted to play a leader because I had played with that group uh, a good bit at that point, and I knew that there was a lot of this timidity there, like what we've been talking about. And I knew that if I was the one doing it, I would be, coaxing people in a direction, but I didn't want it all to be a tyrant. I That's part of why I like was really on board with KP being, number one, like that kind of role, and it became like a side project for me to kind of like groom him for command basically, and I was eventually like looking for an opportunity to step out because I'm playing sorcerer. I wanted to be off doing my own like weird arcane solo pursuits, and this whole mercenary company was just this sort of a thing for the moment. But uh, that was fun. That was a lot of fun, especially when I got to let it go. That During that period is some of the most fun that I had in that game. When KP got to take command and all that. But I really enjoyed it at the beginning too because I the first thing I did was actually build out the structure of the army and put each one of the player characters in command of a unit of that company that suited whatever their specialties were. Um, a scout unit gets a rogue type of character as their unit commander, and so on and so forth. Um, that's that's the way to do it, I think. You have to look at what people are capable of in the group, and the leadership is placing them at a location where they can do that thing that they're great at. And you don't tell them how to do it, you just tell them, what you would like them to do and probably why you would like them to do it. And then they do it to the best of their ability with their own creativity. And uh, I can't think of any other way to do this and not be a micromanaging tyrant, you know?
Yeah, the greatest leaders are the ones who are best at delegation, and that whole campaign was an exercise in proving that point.
For sure. And there were also like quite a few discussions that I remember us having. It was I really wanted to have that conference room on the Enterprise kind of experience over and over again because I think a lot of interesting things happen uh, when you get to hear everyone's side, and that's how you maintain cohesion and you keep uh, you have to know that all of these players are as likely as anything to suddenly rebel when they feel like they're not being listened to, or they're being asked to do something that is undermining their integrity, or something like that. And the the way to lead properly is to figure out what people are wanting to accomplish and help them all do it together, with some synergy in place. That's It's a challenge, but I mean, it's a super rewarding experience, I think, for everyone because like some of these sessions that we've had where we've just sat around and it's not clear which direction we're going to go and people are just bullshitting and we can do this or that or whatever. The pace of progress grinds to a halt, and I don't think anybody enjoys it. So as much as people say, oh, they love being a free individual and all that kind of American culture propaganda, I think it's largely bullshit in some particular way. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. There needs to be somebody who says, "Okay, time for talk is over. Let's act." And unless somebody is the leader, that's going to be entirely dependent on how long it takes for the DM to get completely sick of sitting there listening to the players go on and on and on.
So, have you ever had to be a leader in a group? Because I feel like it's fallen onto me a silly number of times to the point that it's kind of a joke for me at this point when I'm sitting down at one of these games. Like God, be it Abena, be it fucking Ravenloft or whatever. It just I think I'm just the first person to get frustrated enough with the inertia that I just step up and fucking make something happen. But have you ever been in that position as a player character, as a leader of a group, and did you seek it out, or were you just filling a vacuum?
Um, I have made characters who were supposed to be the leaders, but it never happened. I have kind of become the de facto leader before in a game I played several years ago, the one that Gath originated from. In that campaign, the necromancer became the moral center of the group and was kind of calling the shots for everybody.
Oh, that's crazy.
That was a very interesting situation to be in, and but we didn't ever really vote. But whenever it came time for our characters to make decisions, more often than not, it was my character's voice who was the one who basically set the direction. And like you said earlier, with delegating out like the specialties to the other players, that's basically the same way that I was leading at the time. Is well, I was the lieutenant, and I set the goals, and then together we figured out how we were going to accomplish the goals. You need to have somebody who sets the goals. That is the most important thing. That is what the leader needs to do in a role playing game, I feel. All the other talk can come later, but the goal needs to be set, and it needs to be something concrete. Like, okay, this next quest is what we need to do. Let's go do it, and adventure follows as we all go about our own in character, our own unique ways of accomplishing that, but we're all unified in this one quest, and we've decided our leader has decided we're going to approach it from this way. We deal with it because we're coming at it this way.
Yeah, it's a value judgment that the leader makes, and it's there's kind of a conflation of fact and opinion going on there in people's heads, I think, when you're talking about stuff. Like there's a clear requirement that you gather as many facts about the situation as possible so that you're operating in reality. But then there's a space beyond just the factual information, be it fog of war, unknown variables, or be it just preferences or some ordering of priority that no amount of discussion is going to find a right answer for because there's not a right answer. It's just a choice that the leader makes, and that's what you do. And yeah, everybody should give their thoughts and preferences and let their voices be heard or whatever, but you can't really argue with a prioritization of one thing over some equally valuable thing. That's just the call that the leader made, you know.
I want to emphasize something you just said that is very, very important for a leader. Um, the leader needs to make, like, whenever you are presented with a situation in which there is no right answer, or there is no correct way, the leader needs to make the decision of what happens next. They're the ones who, all things being equal, decides the course. I think that's probably going to be my biggest giveaway and takeaway from this, is that the leader doesn't have to be the one dictating what everybody does at every moment. Like you said earlier, you don't want to be a micromanager. The best leaders are really the ones who set the goals, and who, whenever it doesn't matter, they just make a decision and we all go with it. And we don't sit there and we don't squabble about, well, are we going to go left or right at the next intersection in the dungeon?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that every leader is a human, even when they're dwarves or elves or what have you. And so I think that in addition to a leader, every leader needs a second in command too. I think every Picard needs a Riker. Kirk was lucky enough to have both Spock and Bones, but I think the purpose of that role, um, there's a bunch of reasons for that person to be there in the game and in real life, but one of the main ones is to be the one person that can go in and be like, listen, bro, this is bullshit and here's why, and you're up your own ass on something. Someone needs to be able to speak truth to power in a situation, and needs to be able to do it in privacy to save face for the leader. That's the role that always takes in fiction. That's the role that it always takes in real life. I think you're never gonna see some sergeant talking shit to his commander in front of the rank and file troops. That would just undermine the whole thing. Where this comes up in D&D though, much lower stakes, obviously, no real stakes at all. Um, but it's good to have somebody else there, um, to be a sounding board, to be uh, someone else to help you out with some stuff. Like Kyle was invaluable to me when I was having to take that leader role in Abeno. Like it's just so much to manage. You're talking about delegation, like uh, a real effective leader is going to be looking at like bird's eye view kind of scope of things. But then you also want somebody to be dealing with the on the ground, like day to day operations of stuff. And then each, division of that type of stuff is allocated out to someone who's going to be acting as a lieutenant over that domain, right? So um, I don't think the best structure is one leader and then everybody else underneath. I think you want a leader, you want a second in command. You might even want to have some tiers of people below that. And so in Star Trek, the role playing game, you see this come up a lot because you can spend points at character creation to get rank, right? Some people want to play ensigns. Some people want to play lieutenant commanders, and all along the rank in between. So I don't know. Do you think the game would have been better if I had let people pick their rank at the beginning?
No, I think you did a very good job, because you set a couple of ranks immediately below you. Well, for one thing, we had a huge group, so it was a lot easier to do in a huge group. In most groups, I think that you could get by with just having the leader and then a second in command. The way you did it was much more structured, and I think that that it had to be that way because we had a lot more players. We had like 8 or 9, I think, at the start of the game. In a much smaller group, one person who is second in command, and then the other 2 or 3 players are fine to just be the experts in whatever area the player or their characters would be the expert of. So like your example of the fighter being the best leader, the fighter is the one who says, okay, we're going into this dungeon over here because we think we can handle the things that are inside of it. Okay, great, let's go in there. And then once they get in there, the rogue or the ranger is scouting ahead, sneaking just out of the torchlight, and making the decisions there. Well, are we going left or right? I feel I've been in games where the scout goes up to the next intersection, comes back, tells the players, the other characters, what's up ahead. Do we go left or right? And then we vote. That is excruciating. I cannot stand it. I want the scout to be setting the pace as we go through the dungeon, because that's their role. That's their purpose. That's their specialty. Live it, do it. You're the leader then. So all of the characters at some point will be the leader in whatever their specialty is. I think that's probably the best way to do it, and that's exactly how you did it in the Bana game.
So here's a question, and I don't have a good answer for this. I'll just tell you right now. I'm really curious to hear what you have to say. Um, let's say that the party agrees that they're going to have some kind of leadership structure. Let's use my D&D game as an example here. Let's say you all decide we're going to bring back this rank system that you had in the Crusade as the Moles Company, and you're going to work as independent, free company using that framework. And let's say Jack's in control. Okay, he's the commander, and then somebody decides to just straight up disobey Jack's orders. What happens then?
Very good question. How do you handle it when somebody is just going to do the opposite thing or do something different? That's where the social contract of all of the people sitting around the table, you kind of got to work that out. I think that in our game, I would want to have a conversation. Well, it depends on how it happened, but ideally it would be a conversation that happened in game first. If it was just their player or the character deciding to do something else. The first couple of times, I think we should have conversations in character. Hey, get everybody on board. But if it ended up being something that was just a player's style, they can't stand to sit in and do their part or follow the leader as we go through the dungeon or navigate some sort of social situation. I think then maybe an out of character conversation would be best to deal with why it is that they're doing this. If it's something that is actually disrupting the group, it can be a situation where one player is doing it for the role playing in order to to get something out of the game that they are wanting.
Elliot did that with Barley.
Yeah, I think that with that, it ended up being something that that we all fed off of. With what Elliot did, I didn't see it really bleeding through into our out of character. But I didn't really talk a whole lot with the other players, so I couldn't tell you whether or not that's true.
No, not at all. Jack loved it. He said later that was some of the best role play he had. Like it was awesome to get into a yelling match with another player in character over something that's like a legit thing like that. Um, that's one of those things that it's one of those interesting bits that I think the timid style of play is impoverished for is not being able to have those in your face kind of moments. I, I don't see it much. I think it takes a certain set of players. Um, that was fun. That was a cool power struggle to watch. I laughed my ass off.
Yeah, it was, as a player, it was a ball. In Kyle's The Wanderers game, like literally the reason why I was continuing to come to each session is because of the spats your character and mine got into over all the little things that a rogue and a paladin could get into an argument over.
Oh, dude, that was great. That was like archetypal, mythological quarrels. It was amazing.
We're starting to get a little bit long. Do you want to go over any of the leadership um, advice that you have written down there? Just
I kind of weaved them in there. I guess there's a few that I can go over explicitly that I think uh, bear uh, some kind of repeating. Hang on.
well, lay them on me because I really only have my only advice on being a leader is actually sit down and fucking read Sun Tzu's The Art of War. It's really not very long. It's like less than 100 pages. You can get through it pretty quickly, and it is chock full of just really like badass sayings and good advice.
Oh yeah, for sure, definitely. Um, so a few things like I mentioned before, like a good leader should know their team and should put them in situations where their teammates' skills shine. It's important that you're not using other people's characters as tools to accomplish your goal, but rather you're all agreed on a goal and you are putting the pieces in place for everything to work as a well-oiled machine, and people get the gratification of succeeding at stuff that they've built their character to be good at, and the further gratification of helping the entire group along with it. Everybody gets gratitude for each other's skills and the a recognition of the symbiosis that you have, and it forms tighter bonds with the entire group. So I think that's far superior than just kind of hoping that people kind of randomly clatter down the hallway and happen to be in the spot that they're supposed to be in to be optimal. So that's one. Um, let's see, what's another good one? Um, so one thing I think is part of the burden of leadership is the maintaining the trust of your teammates, and you do that by showing integrity for one thing. Um, you have to show that you're bringing your A game. You're there to help everybody out. You're not fucking anybody over. You're not bullying anybody. You're not there to demean anyone, but you're trying to create some context for people to shine. Like I was saying before, you're you're trying to lead the orchestra, right? Um, and when you fuck up, you hear what people have to say about it. You revise procedures accordingly, and then you go try again. This seems basic, but in the moment, people get super flustered about stuff and people lose their nerve, people get anxious, and all these like real fundamental things kind of start falling out of your head. But if you kind of keep these like very basic tenets of good leadership in your head, whatever weird context you happen to find yourself in, you'll figure out how to adapt it to the particulars of those circumstances. So what else? Let's see here.
I would like to add on that one thing that the leader should be doing, and this is in any situation, the leader should be making the people who they're leading feel like they are heard whenever they say something. It doesn't the leader doesn't have to follow the advice, but the leader should let them know that the advice has been heard.
Mm-hmm. Agree completely. Yeah. Once again, Captain Picard, all the time. He listens to everything anybody has to say. He picks one and goes with it because often they're in conflict. Um, if you're Worf, he'll never do what you say, but everybody else, there's pretty decent chance he's gonna do what you suggest.
That's not true. There's like 2 times when he actually listens to what Worf says.
Over 7 years.
Over 7 years, and literally every single episode, Worf throws out an idea, and he's like, "No, Worf."
Well, to be fair, Worf's idea is usually open fire. Um, I guess the only other thing that I'd like to emphasize again is that a good leader is not going to ask anybody to take risks that they wouldn't take themselves. And here's one of those places. I harp on this all the time. but here is one of those places where the rules of the game system that you're playing really do dictate behavior at the table. And in fifth edition, I think it's so nerfed, everything is so safe and bubble wrapped that a lot of this shit just doesn't matter because there aren't any consequences to not doing these things. But when you play in a lethal game that has straight up save or die consequences for fucking around, that's when you realize like we need to be on it. We need to be alert. We need to be working together. We can't fuck up because there's no room for error. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's all I got.
All right. I guess we'll move on to geek things. I really don't have a geek thing, but I did have an interesting thought on how to write some interesting RPG scenarios. I have been watching some movie trailers for older movies, and it occurred to me that watching movie trailers for movies you know absolutely nothing about is an awesome way to come up with a scenario that you could play through, because most trailers, well, before trailers started giving away the entire plot of a movie in the trailer, they just gave you hooks. They just gave you interesting ideas to play with. And if you watch, like, something I've started doing since I've been watching some of these, I've been jotting down some game notes on how I might make a scenario that has those different plot points in it that have been shown in the trailer. So my geek thing is just an observation that I've had that I'm trying out on how to write or how to come up with ideas for game adventures.
Nice. So my geek thing is going to be directly leadership related. There is a podcast by a guy named Jocko Willink. Some people have probably heard of him. It's called the Jocko Podcast. Jocko was a Navy SEAL. He did. I just looked him up. He did 20 years in the SEALs. He got the Silver Star. All around badass. One of the few examples that spring to mind of a real world version of like a high level fucking hero. This dude's that. He's got a lot of hit dice, I guarantee it. But his podcast talks a lot about, you know, leadership related issues, and he has lots and lots of examples of like actual battlefield situations. And you know, if you're gonna get some advice and thoughts from anybody, I defy you to find someone with more practical expertise than somebody like this. So, the Jocko Podcast. Give it a try.
All right, sounds good. Well, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Let's do it.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.